In this video, I'm going to cover my entire process end to end on how I build and manage AI agent teams. And I'm going to be honest, this is going to be a bit advanced, not super beginner friendly, but you should be able to take away some key lessons from it. I'm going to just show you what really works for me on a day-to-day basis, and this process might change over time. I suggest that if you want to keep up to date on my process, go ahead and hop into my page community. That's where you're going to get all the latest resources, all the latest templates and things that I'm using to build out these teams. So before we get into this, let's just orient you on what we're going to cover today. The first thing I'm going to start with is why building and selling AI agents is messy. Then I'm going to do a quick demo of one of the agents I've built. It's basically a technical strategist. It's going to give us back a PRD. I'm going to go into a deep dive on the backend architecture. I know a lot of you are struggling in this area, so I'm going to make sure to highlight some of the key components I'm using. Then I'm going to go through how I manage everything with Cursor, especially with it being my IDE of choice. Then I'm going to walk through the deployment process I have with SST that helps me just keep my sanity in terms of making changes to these agents. Starting with building and selling AI agents is messy. I'm just going to rattle off a couple things you might be familiar with. Maybe you haven't run into these problems yet. I think the number one thing is really just dealing with these automation errors. These happen randomly inside of your workflows, randomly inside of your systems. And most people, they really just start building things until they get it to work, quote unquote, and then that's it. They throw their hands up and I'm done. In reality, this is a very much long-term process. Once you build something, you have to think about how am I going to maintain it? Am I going to make sure that this is working on a day-to-day basis, especially if I send it out to clients and send it out to customers. And so not having a easy process to deal with errors can really start to bite you, and then things start bubbling up over time and this becomes a fire. Managing APIs is actually difficult, and this could be simple when you have one or two APIs that you're managing, one or two API keys. The second you get into like 4, 5, 10 APIs that you're all using all these different services, it gets really complicated to make sure that you're updating things that are necessary. Maybe you have a little bit of a snippet of code in this workflow, snippet of code over here, or maybe you have an API that's updated recently and it's doing breaking changes across your workflows. And how do you deal with that? How do you manage that? What system do you have? What process do you have that's in place to handle these type of scenarios? And then I think this is a really sneaky one. Moving data between systems. Let's say one client has Airtable, another client has MongoDB, another client has a Postgres database that's hosted inside of their on-prem environment. Like how are you going to be dealing with all these different data silos that you have to deal with? And especially people have messy data, so their maturity might not be up to par in terms of building out these AI agents. They just might not be ready to build out these AI agents and need to do a big data migration effort. So this becomes another component that can really hinder projects that are moving forward. And dealing with changing requirements. This is one it's called scope creep if you haven't ever dealt with this, but it usually starts off you have a project and there's a set of functionality or features or things you need to build. But then as you get into the project, reality hits and things change, requirements change. And of course, you might have a process to go through the change with your client and the change inside of your project. But at the end of the day, when it comes to your actual architecture, your system that you're building, it does not accommodate change really well. If you've built it in a certain way, it can be really difficult to pivot and change direction without having to throw the entire thing out. If you've been AI coding for a bit, you might have a project, and at some point you get to a place where it doesn't make sense to throw out all the code and change everything over because you're just going to lose all your progress. And I think this one is going to sneak up on people in maybe later on this year is sharing workflows with clients. Right now, everyone's just throwing around zip files and JSON. And yeah, this works as like a temporary band-aid, but overall, you're going to get stuck in this situation where you're going to have 10, 15 people all on different versions of your workflow and they're all using different JSON templates or whatever it is. And so that's just going to be complicated to manage and troubleshoot and provide support for. And so how am I actually addressing these problems? And to be honest, I haven't found a good way to do it within the agency model when you're doing like AI automations. And so I've been looking at really building out a product for myself that I can package up these workflows, package up these agents in a way that's really easy to use. And so the model I'm moving over to is called agentic SaaS. This is agents with service as a software, meaning it's really easy to make this entire thing self-service, effectively removing you from done for you work and allowing you to really just invest time in building out the workflows, building out the automations, and presenting a very clean and easy to use UI to your clients. No like prompt engineering degree required here because they don't have to beg and plead with the models to get a certain response in a certain format. And it's also really good for you because it's an entirely managed backend. You are focused on making sure the backend works, making sure everything is connected correctly, integrated correctly, but the presentation layer of it is what's interacting with the clients. And there's also clear deliverables with value attached to it. So there's no need to haggle around the value that's being provided by your deliverables. It's a credit-based system. They're essentially just going to pay per outcome. And I really like this model because it's simplifying what I have to do on a day-to-day basis. And it'll also provide clear value upfront to whoever I'm doing business with. This is a practical example of what I'm talking about. Instead of it being hundreds of agents, everyone can build your own agent platform. That's not really the goal here. The goal is to handle all the things on the back end for your clients, and then they can simply just use the AI agents. This is for folks who have no interest in actually building the agents. They just want something that works out of the box. And it's kept simple here on purpose. I do plan on adding in a lot of functionality later down the line. But for now, I want to keep it simple, make sure I have solid infrastructure. It's like building out the roads and the highways before you start putting cars and traffic on top of it. And so for an example here, I'm going to use one of these agents. The most interesting one to me is the MVP strategist. I'm almost essentially replacing myself here, where before I would help people write out these PRDs and then get started with their MVPs. I think with AI coding, you can almost skip that entire step of getting someone to consult with you on an MVP. You can just use agents to do this in a variety of ways. Some people are using Cursor, some people are using ChatGPT and OpenAI. And so this agent I've built here is not to say, oh, this hasn't been done before. I just want my clients to do it with me, with my set of tooling in a way that I can actually just customize the outcome a little bit. So let's actually hop into the MVP strategist. I'm going to hire it right now. And I get a nice overview of what it does and a clear indication of the deliverable I'm going to get and then how many credits I'm going to spend. If you ever use Fiverr or Upwork or one of these freelancing sites before, it's like that. You get a little description of what they do and then also what you're going to get, some frequently asked questions. And then I can hit start now. This is going to take me to an intake form with the agent. Imagine if you had a process with a consultant and you needed to kick off the work, right? There's always like a period of time. They just need to collect information from you. I call this the context. And in this scenario right now, it's just placing an order, basically collecting what you need. And so now I just need to place that order. It's about 20 credits. I'm giving a little bit of feedback here because this is a background job that's going to process for a little bit. That means the user's not going to get some immediate feedback. Now, I do have plans to add in some type of streaming, maybe a chat here where you can chat with multiple agents. For now, I'm going to keep it really simple. And also, even the agent itself is really simple. It's just working on top of OpenAI's Assistance API. So it's easy to extend down the line as well. So this is going to take a minute or two. I'm going to actually just let it run and then we'll come back and check up on the deliverable. It's complete. We're going to take a quick look at the deliverable on this Fiverr for AI agents idea that I have here. It's a bit meta. Okay, so it gives us the core use cases. I'm going to bring up my pointer. It gives us the core use cases, which is nice. The non-functional requirements, which I added in. It even improved the prompt a little bit on the back end as well. And so here we get a data model that's basically something you can feed to another agent to start working on this, maybe set up the database. So I like that it calls out the client. We have an agent here, and then there's a task, and then the deliverable, which is fine. And then the domain model as well. So it's the same set. These can be somewhat different in some systems, but for here, it's simple enough. We're just doing CRUD, pretty much the same. And then a service design. So I like here that it splits out the core domain. So these are a couple services that we want. It calls out that we're going to be using DynamoDB and S3 for storage, and then a couple of other external adapters here. I like that it's saying we're going to use SQS. This is like the messaging thing in AWS, REST API gateway, and then Event Bridge as well. So this is not a bad start at all. And here it does give a OpenAI specification. The formatting is not good. I have to fix some of that formatting. I can do that in another time. And then a deployment and architecture recommendations. It says here for deployment, it's recommended to use AWS Fargate, which is fine. I think that's okay. And then leverage Event Bridge, Event Bus, SQS for command bus integrations, SNS for notifications. Yeah, this is all fine. And I would actually take this and modify it a little bit and give it back to a client or someone who's asking me about how do I build a thing with AWS, and I'm giving them my insights and advice. This is okay. Overall, I can even make some edits to the prompt on the back end to make it even more tailored to what I would want to do. But I can see someone who's getting started, I would have no problem giving them this as like a starting off point. Now, I use different AWS tools. I don't use CloudFormation. I don't use Terraform, but those are really some of the standard things being used in the industry right now. So it's good that it picked that up. Okay. So overall, this is the system. It's very simple. But I hope you can see how you can potentially start to extend this. Let's say this is not enough, right? Of course, you have deliverables that you have to give over to your clients, automations. They might need more services. You can easily add a button here that's just like your services, right? And it goes to maybe some type of book a call funnel that you have. Book a call here. Or maybe on the deliverables themselves, you can have another button that's saying, hey, let's do another version 2 edit. And then it takes some more credits. And you can also add in any plethora of tools here that can make it easier for this system to work. My plans are to add context and add a chat as well, because people like to chat. So I got to make the chat interface. And so those are going to be two things I'm working on this year to put into this application. All right, let's jump into the backend and really get into the fun stuff, see how this works underneath the hood. In the backend architecture, I'm using a simple pattern in the abstract called the backend for front end, where this is basically my backend here, and then this is my front end here. So we really just split it up into two sections. And this is good because most folks you'll see online right now, the way they're building these apps is as one single agent in memory. And that's really bad because you're coupling the data model with the UI model. It leads to all types of inconsistencies and problems down the line that folks are just not aware of. And so this pattern effectively just decouples the two. So you can have a separate UI experience, but that doesn't mean you have to change your data model all the time in terms of how the tables are set up or how it works with retrieving that data. You can put a little bit of a buffer in between the UI and the data that is accessing. And so overall with this pattern, I basically have a Next.js app here hosted on a CDN, and the CDN is CloudFront. Although I haven't run into any issues, I know a lot of people do not like using Next.js with another type of provider. I tend to not want to host it on Vercel because there's just so many limitations and weird behavior going on. So I like to just go directly into AWS. You could choose to not. You could choose to just directly host on Vercel. And in this setup here with Next.js and CloudFront, I'm also using SST to deploy this. So SST is the automation tool that's doing all the deployment for me. And in reality, this really is Open Next. And so Open Next is the open source alternative to Next.js that you can host anywhere. It just makes things a little bit easier. All right, at this layer in the orchestration layer, I'm just using API Gateway here. And it's just a basic REST HTTP API. Nothing fancy is happening here at all. And I just really want a way to do request and response between the front end and the back end. And so the orchestrator handles like the routing of where everything goes. And if I zoom in here, you'll see that I have a Lambda function for just about a ton of endpoints. And so each of these Lambda functions will be some type of route. So let's say this is get something, right? And then this will be a post something. I don't know what these are specifically because they all have the AWS name to them, but they match to a specific function in the system that happens or gets kicked off. For example, when we did our PRD with the MVP strategist agent, it went to one of these lambdas as an endpoint, and then that got kicked off later. So the lambdas will then hit either a order queue or a task queue. There's also this dead letter queue here in case anything fails, so it goes into that queue as well. And the next interesting bit, so this is the interesting part. I have a agent layer here, and the agent layer is basically backed by a pattern. You can see each agent has the same pattern. There's a queue in front of the agent. And so when the agent is listening on this queue, right, it's just listening for what's happening. And once an event comes into the queue, it then kicks off the agent. Then the agent will do whatever downstream task that it needs to do. And so this is all message based. This allows me to not have to complicate my agents because all they're doing is waiting on a message. And I can always change what's happening. So here, if I need OpenAI one day, so OpenAI can be my provider one day, and then next I can switch over to Claude if I want to. But the only thing that needs to remain consistent is this message that's coming in over time. I also go through this in depth inside of my paid community, and I've also written out all this in documentation as well. So you can go into the description and check out the docs on your free time if you really want to deep dive into the architecture patterns around this. Now, the last bit is the data. And I think this is what's most important about managing AI agents right now. And people don't mention a lot. They talk a lot about how much autonomy are you giving the agents and what framework are you using, but no one is talking about how do these agents actually access data? Because this will make or break your entire system, realistically. If you don't have good, clean data in a structured way, the agents are practically useless because they struggle to interface with anything outside of the context of the model itself. I just have a bunch of DynamoDB tables. I have a deliverables table. There should be an orders table here. I have a way to manage API keys as well. And then I have my users here. And each of these tables are segregated by a user ID. And so I know how to retrieve the exact data for my user, but not retrieve data that they shouldn't be seeing. That's how I get the orders and and you'll probably see something interesting here. The DynamoDB is pointing to a Lambda. What is that all about? When something happens in the system, usually what you want to do is persist that the event occurred. And so as this event occurs in a system, I actually have a Lambda listening to a few of these tables. And so when a new order is placed or new deliverable hits, I can kick off a Lambda that'll do a subsequent action. This way, you can kind of load what the agent has to do down to a different layer where it's just more important that type of information persists. That way we get no mistakes because the agents are going to introduce a lot of randomness to the process that is very unnecessary. Okay, and this entire system on its face value could just be looked at as like a tiered system as well, but really it is a decoupled event-driven system with some mixture here with request response. And I've been using this for about 2 years to really build out things. I've refined it over time. Things may change as well, but I find this is a really good happy medium. And so right now, everything's pretty much hosted in one region. That's what you see here. I have removed the VPC and all that type of configuration where it's like network security. And also I don't include that in the open source version of this, but you can always extend it. It's just AWS. You can get into the details there. And what I want to go through next is actually how I manage all of this in Cursor, because overall, I don't even know how many resources this is. So let's do this. We're going to highlight everything. So let's highlight everything in here. And so you'll see about 112 items. So these are like the front facing resources. I'm sure there's more resources. And it costs about $3 a day to manage all of this on AWS. The tool I'm using is Cloudcraft here, and I get a good detailed estimated cost of what I'm doing, and I can also put in estimates. So this is at about 500,000 requests a month. My API gateway is about 5 million requests a month. It's really not that much, but I'm not doing a ton of traffic just yet. As things scale up, let's say if I went to venture scale, of course I'd be spending more money, but that's something I'm prepared to do since this is a business and not just a hobby project that I'm doing. So if I look at price, I can sort by price here. The most expensive part of this is going to be my Lambdas. That's at doing 500,000 requests. So it's just not that much. Now, let's say I wanted to estimate if I did 10 million requests, right? It still doesn't go up that much. I doubt anyone's doing 10 million requests right now. Plus, the way I kind of position these apps is I don't want a large volume of people just churning through the app. It's really meant for a specific group of folks with specific deliverable needs, not just mass market consumer apps. So in Cursor here, I have a couple things pulled up. The first one is my SST console. And I want to walk through this very quickly because this is the heartbeat of how I manage everything with AWS, because it can actually take an entire team of developers to manage AWS. But using this tool, I completely circumvent all of that. and I'm able to really operate like a team of 5 to 10 developers using this. For example, here, I'm just going to run into my API, and a lot of folks will ask, like, how do you actually, go to prod? How do you push to prod? This is how you push prod. Prod is not really like a magical place or anything like that. It is simply a set of practices. How do you separate your development environment from your production environment? I think that's what it really comes down to. And a couple of nice things about SST is that I have auto deploy set up, where every time I make a push or git commit on a certain branch, it'll follow a set of predefined rules to actually do that deployment. And here's pretty simple. I just did a PR a couple hours ago on my main branch, and this one succeeded here. And that's what pushed all my resources up to AWS in prod. And if I go back here, you'll see in dev as well, I did the same kind of workflow. And then I iterate a lot more in dev than I do in production. And so the last push here, I can go directly to where the deployment happened, and I can see all the resources that it created and how that works. And if I can even click into the GitHub commit, and I'll see like the specific changes that I made as well. It's just a little bit easier to manage the deployments. You don't have to do everything yourself with CI/CD. Now, this is completely optional when you're using SST. This is not for everybody. I pay for the convenience, and so I manage about 1,000 active resources with this. The project I just showed you is like one of my projects. I have multiple projects going on, and it cost me about $86 a month. And with SSC, you get the first 350 free, which is great. Most of you who are probably building out an app probably will never bump past this free tier here. This is completely fine because the way I compare this is, okay, I would have to hire developers to maintain and manage my CI/CD pipelines and things. So this is like a drop in the bucket cost in comparison. The cool thing is I can just go to the browser using simple browser and manage this all inside of Cursor as well. One thing I want to call out here with Cursor is that I separate my repos by what I was saying before, right? I have a separate API here. I have a separate dashboard. I have a repo for landing pages, and I have specifications here when I'm exploring something. I want to figure out how do I actually do that integration with the tool. And so if I jump into the API here, I think I've shown the structure before, but I want to call out that infrastructure here is just managed very simply. There's an API, has all my endpoints. Here's my database. No complicated Prisma here. Shout out to Prisma, but I really don't like using ORMs at all anymore. And here's the index that just exports things out. Here's a queue. The queues, all the queues that I'm using, you saw those before. Secrets, I'm not going to show those. Streams, these are things that are streaming off the DynamoDB tables. And then the topics. So everything really is, although it's code, this is just TypeScript. It's very declarative in its nature. That means there's not a lot of fancy logic happening here. I'm just calling out what I want and then letting SST go ahead and deploy that for me. And if you haven't seen an SST configuration before, it takes a little bit of time to learn it, but an hour, not even an hour, maybe like a few minutes to read over their documentation, and you'll probably understand how this works. Overall, you just import your infrastructure, and then that'll kick off how it gets set up. And notice here that I'm using Cloudflare. So although I can use AWS, SST is not AWS specific. You can use things like DigitalOcean. You can use Pulumi directly, which plugs in to a lot of different resources. So I'm actually using Cloudflare as a front end to my front end. So Cloudflare is doing all the protection, helps defend against DDoS attacks as well. And the interesting bit here is when I go into my packages, let's actually go find where this agent layer is. So here's the agent plane. And inside the agent plane, I have my technical strategist, because when I was developing it, I called it a technical strategist. By the time I made it to the front end, it has a different name. And here I'm just using the AMU pattern. I've talked about this at length as well. And in the AMU pattern, let's go into the secondary. We'll find the OpenAI adapter. And so in this OpenAI adapter is where all the work is happening. And I can just walk through this real quickly. Basically, there's, I think, 2 functions in here, 3. And there's this create text strategy, which is doing the bulk of the work. This is waiting for the run completion. It's just doing some handling on the OpenAI assistant. And then this is like a wrapper here that allows me to retry this if it fails. So I have 3 retries with a delay. That usually gets it done. I know I do need a more sophisticated retry and handling strategy for this. And so wait for completion here. I'll go through that one first. Basically, it just goes through the different states of the assistant. And then when the assistant submits its tool, like tool calls, it will work through those outputs and then return them back to the runtime. And here with the create strategy, this is the meat of how everything works. I'm using this interesting pattern that OpenAI had in one of its cookbooks. It's this Zod to JSON schema and this Zod response format. Zod allows you to really define the structure of your inputs and your outputs when you're working with OpenAI. And you can see I'm using the assistance API here, and I'm also using O3 Mini. We're going to switch to the pointer. Okay, and then here's the first step. You're starting a thread. We're going to add our messages to that thread. Then we're going to run the threads. So this is like the setup. This is the actual run. And then we're going to wait for that to complete. And after that, we're just going to do a ton of parsing and cleaning up for the agent. Now, my thoughts on OpenAI's Assistance API, I get it. I like that it allows you to tap into a vector database as well, and that this is going to be their agent thing moving forward. I actually hope they maybe redo this and release something a little bit different. I'm tempted to go back to the chat completions way of doing this. So guys, let me know what your opinion is on this. I might switch back and forth between the two, but for now, I think this is a lot of extra work, which is not really needed, especially because I don't think I'm going to use the vector database from OpenAI, but this is how it works right now, and I've just been going with it for now. All right, so that's basically the entire setup in Cursor. It's not complicated, and I think people overcomplicate how they're using Cursor. As long as you have a clean folder structure like this, and you have good separations of concern, you should be able to really generate any new feature that you need. And so inside of my Cursor rules, I don't really have anything. I found that Cursor rules just get ignored anyways, so I stopped using them over time. All right, so my Git strategy with Cursor basically is each of those folder structures you saw here, it's not just that they're separated by folder, they're actually separated by source control. And that allows me to make really pointed edits. And instead of impacting the dashboard, impacting the API, I can really keep it to one set of things getting edited at a time and really constrain the context that Cursor has to deal with as well. A couple extension and things. I might make a video that kind of goes through all my tips and tricks for Cursor. All right, so let's look at how a deployment works here. And we're just going to make a simple change. I actually want to change how the MVP agent shows up. And so we're going to call it a PRD agent now. So let me go into my components. It's a very simple change, but you could imagine that these changes will have to propagate throughout the entire system. There's multiple things you have to update over time. And so the way I build agents in this system is that I have inside of the dashboard area, there is this library folder here that contains all the agents that I'll build. And they all follow this certain config. And here is this config. Let me go to it. And the config lists out a couple of things that are interesting to the agent on the front end. One is the number of credits that it'll have to use. I have a nice little image URL here. I just pull one from Unsplash. Then a bunch of things that kind of describe the agent as well. And the most important part is this handler function. This handler function actually reaches out into the backend API that I have set up right here. And so the backend API will have an endpoint that's specific for this agent. Some people say maybe that's too much of a one-to-one. I actually like it that way because it allows me to fine-grain troubleshoot or debug things that are happening. I don't have to look through a mess of logs. I really just know, okay, this is the endpoint for this agent. That's the one I need to go look at. Also, this pattern would break down if I had thousands of agents. Like this just wouldn't make sense anymore. I would have to do a larger abstraction. This works perfectly for 4 to 5 agents. I don't plan on scaling past 20, 30, but in reality, even at that point, I might have to do a little bit of a rewrite and abstract things up. All right, so this agent config is going to call a couple things. It's going to call this agent service. This kind of handles all of the different backend calls to the API endpoint. Now, why am I not just using Next? To be honest, you're right. I probably should just be using Next, but I just find it so confusing. It's constantly changing. It's annoying to me. I just wrote out my own little mini API routing thing. So that just works better for me. And you'll see here, there's this handle text strategy request. This is the handler function that'll get called for the specific agent. I'm passing in a token, so everything is secure. On the back end, it's a JWT token that gets authorized. And overall, I get a really good understanding of how this works. So this is the entire agent config for the text strategist, quote unquote, that I'm going to be renaming to the PRD writer. Another thing I want to call out is that I have a deliverable section here for the agent. So instead of just letting the agent respond in anything with chat, that's not the point. I really want to make it responsible for a deliverable, and making sure that deliverable is consistent for each and every person that makes an order means that I need to provide some type of schema that is used by the agent. And so here on the front end, I just define that schema, and this is what's rendered out on the deliverable page. And so you'll see here some of the things that I pulled up from before, which was use case, non-functional requirements, the data model, the domain model, the service design, the API design, and then the actual deployment strategy as well. All right, if we go into the API here, I'm going to open that up, and let's take a look at one of the endpoints. We should find the tech strategy endpoint. So you'll see here, things change. Small little differences. I'm calling it PRD agent, PRD writer on the front end, tech strategy endpoint. And so over time, I can make these small little adjustments here and there based on how people call things instead of going into my database and having to change up everything. It's just very modular that way. So the post request happens to this tech strategy post endpoint right here. So I jump into functions, go over to the orchestrator. I have this handle request strategy here. And I have this wrapper over the request text strategy adapter. And that allows me to really write anything I want for this adapter. I could put in a different adapter here and still maintain all the same structure from before. Now, of course, there's easier ways to write this API. There's frameworks and things you can use that can make this entire thing one line of code. That's not the point. What I really want to do is handle all parts of my infrastructure separately and not mix the concerns. So here, all I'm concerned about is handling AWS on the front end, like how the AWS event comes in and making sure that I'm doing a ton of logging and all the things that are needed to happen from like a infrastructure perspective. So the SaaS vending machine will get the user, make sure we have a valid user, and then from there, we can actually just call out a use case, and that's what's going to kick off everything else on the back end. So I don't want to get into too much of it. I've already dove into how this works in other videos as well, so you can go back and check out the catalog. I also dive into this within my paid community, so you can get into all of these details here, but I'll try to keep it really short since this is a big code base. All right, so we have a change that's going to go in on the dashboard. I'll put here, updating the tech strategist. Tech strategist to PRD writer. So this is a very superficial change for sure. I'll just hit commit here, and then we'll sync those changes. Then I'll open a PR. Obviously, this would be a more complicated PR with some more stuff here, but I'm just doing it for example. And we're going to create that PR. And of course, in your scenario, you would want to have a bunch of tests that are written out, that are automatically running in the CI/CD pipeline to prevent you pushing to main. But I know for sure this is going to pass, and I'm just YOLOing it right now for the entertainment. So let's merge in the pull request. And I'm doing this all from Cursor. I haven't had to leave Cursor at all. This is all going to execute up in AWS for me. All right, there you go. I found the two deployments. One is kicking off in dev. The other one is kicking off in main right here. And so if we go into the main branch, this is kicking off a deployment into my production environment. Back here, you'll see that there's a little indicator that these two are deploying. Usually I'll be deploying the dev. I'll do some testing, do a lot more work, then deploy the prod. So it's very rare that I'll be doing these two at the same time. Flipping back over to the dashboard, you'll see here that I have my very simple change that I've made. And I really don't want to harp on like the specific change, but the process that I just took. Very calm, not super chaotic. I just made an update to my dashboard, did a git commit, and then everything else just automatically was handled. So if you don't have one of those processes in place, that's probably why you're feeling all this tension with Cursor in terms of trying to manage edits. It's deleting all your stuff. It's not working. It's because there's just a little bit of setup up front you have to do to really get it working. And this is what I've found really works for me, and it's worked for me for months now. And I don't really have that many complaints at all. I have basically gone in and really documented out this entire thing within the self-hosting version of Agentic Team OS. It really goes through all these concepts I talked about today. So you can really sit down and take your time to go through this. I also have a quick start guide that walks through all the steps. I should have a link to this in the description of this video. And this will just help you get set up with your first version of what I have here, if you're interested in doing it this way. If not, I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. You might have a completely different way you want to do this, which is absolutely fine. I think there's 100 ways to do this. If you want the templates that I'm using, you can go to step number 2. There should be like a create a new repository from the API template. If you click that, it should bring up this screen here. Make sure you don't click include all branches. Choose who you want to do it under, give you a spicy repository name, and you should be on your way. I have instructions on how to set up your environment variables that you need and the API stuff you need. In my community, I go through this in more detail because this might change, but inside of the community, I can always make updates and updates to the documentation and swap out the videos when things change. Hopefully this is really helpful to just make the system a lot clearer in terms of building out agents. And the goal is to shift your mindset on the approach. Instead of trying to build everything from scratch in a single Python script and then ship it and having to deal with all the complexity that comes from that, maybe taking a step back and reorienting yourself around just the customer experience and making sure that is set up really well. And then also on your back end, you know how to publish these agents. And so you might not want to use my system, and that's completely fine. I still encourage you to take the time to document what you're doing and just streamline it so it's not chaotic every single time. You're not dealing with an absolute mess of things when it comes to building out your AI agent team. Hopefully, this was really helpful. If you want this process, jump into the docs and then you'll be able to go through all of this on your own time.